This episode is presented by Brex, the financial stack founders can bank on. Learn more at brex.com/techcrunch24. Creating creative educational playtime opportunities for kids could be a full-time job. And while we know hands-on projects are good for little brains, it's unrealistic for most parents to just come up with these kinds of games themselves. Luckily, this week's guest says she has found a solution.
You're listening to Found, TechCrunch's podcast that brings you the stories behind the startups. Today we're talking to Sandra Oh Lin from KiwiCo, a company that creates toy kits for imaginative play and learning. I'm Becca Skutak, and here to talk all about how to build a children's toy company is my fabulous co-host,
Dominic Midori-Davis. And of course, before we get into our conversation with Sandra, we have our two truths and a lie. And at the end, we'll tell you which one of these statements just isn't true. Listen carefully. Is the lie that in the early days, KiwiCo tested their products with kids but didn't survey parents? That they've expanded into schools as well as brick and mortar stores? Or that Sandra's parents also sold toys?
Listeners, you'll have to keep listening to figure out which one of those statements are true and which one is the lie. But before we dive into our conversation with Sandra, a quick reminder to rate and review the show. You can do so wherever you are already listening to this episode, so super easy on your end and super helpful on ours. Here's our conversation with Sandra. Hi, Sandra. How's it going?
Good. It's nice to meet you too.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you as well. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Of course. My pleasure.
I'm excited about this one because I will admit, as a childless woman in their 20s, I don't know a ton about this space, so I'm definitely excited to kind of learn more. Maybe you want to start by telling us a little bit about KiwiCo.
Sure. So at KiwiCo, we design and we deliver hands-on projects for kids. So imagine engineering projects, games you can make and play, art activities. And the intent behind these different experiences is to encourage kids to exercise their creativity, exercise their critical thinking skills, and hopefully see themselves as people who can envision something and make that a reality. We've been around for over 10 years. We've delivered over 50 million crates, which is what we call each delivery, since we're a direct-to-consumer e-commerce company at the core, and have grown quite a bit since we started with that intent of basically empowering kids to become innovators. It's stayed with us all through the years.
What brought you to this space? I know, looking through your background, you worked at a couple of the companies that were startups at the time, like Poshmark and PayPal and things like that. What brought you to this space specifically?
Yeah, I mean, my background kind of career-wise has been product development. So I was a chemical engineer by training. So I was in product development at Procter & Gamble, so consumer products. And then I moved into the tech space. This dates me a little bit, but was around as a product manager at the beginning of the first .com boom, and then ended up going to a couple of different startups, went to PayPal, actually, and then eBay when it was all part of eBay Inc. at the time. Then I was thinking that I wanted to potentially join a smaller company. I had two kids, so they were 2 and 4. I was at the point where I really wanted them to have hands-on experiences. And part of it was maybe that I was an engineer. Part of it was that I did these hands-on experiences when I was growing up as a kid. So I really wanted my kids to have that experience, that idea of like creating something, making something, feeling like they had agency over something. And so I started to pull these ideas together, different hands-on projects. And I would invite my friends and their kids. And one of the moms was like, you should start a business around this. This is really amazing. And my first thought was like, wow, this could be a really, really fun business to work on. But my other thought was, gosh, this isn't going to be much of a business if it's a n=1 or n=2 problem.
Right.
If it's just the two of us, like that's certainly not going to be enough. And so just kind of went down the journey of exploring whether or not there was a market for what we were thinking. And we've been really fortunate. As I've mentioned, we've shipped out millions and millions of crates at this point. So we've hit upon something where we're delivering something that's super fun and also enriching for kids. And for parents, I mean, we're busy, we're super well-intentioned. We could use a little help in terms of offering these experiences to our kids. And so something that comes so conveniently, something that's delightful, something that embeds a little bit of learning is something that parents really buy into.
Definitely. No, I resonate with that story a lot. I'm the child of engineers who obviously did not end up falling down that path, but I totally understand what you're talking about with that kind of toys and growing up in that way. But I'm curious because you mentioned when you first came up with the idea and we're chatting about it, you were like, I don't actually know if I can make this a business. What changed your mind?
It was a lot of talking to people, actually. And it's interesting. I told you a little bit about my background. And when you're at a Procter & Gamble or at an eBay at the time, you have a decent sized budget to be able to do product development, to be able to do market research. And so we had to do it in a really scrappy, resourceful way. So I remember in the beginning doing concept testing through focus groups in my living room, making sure they weren't my friends, but were kind of friends of friends of friends type of thing, bringing people together to get their feedback for kids of all ages. I remember sending out surveys through SurveyMonkey and making sure it went nationally, making sure we're seeding it in different places in Tennessee and Ohio and other places, because I do feel like where I am, which is the Bay Area, is a special place. So you may get a certain type of feedback here versus what you would get from others too. So that was really important as well. And we did a lot of testing eventually of the product itself. And that was both with parents, but also with kids. We would reach out to moms groups in the areas. My garage was always filled with kids as they were testing what we wanted to put out into the world. And that was incredibly helpful to us. We learned a lot at the time around what is actually accessible for kids, what is fun, how are the ways we could have that little kind of delightful moment of discovery and learning for kids. And so that's really what took us to a place where we felt like, okay, we have something here with, frankly, two customers, right? We have the big customers, which are the parents, and then we have the little customers who are the kids.
And it's so interesting to hear about, especially when you guys were doing these surveys, that you made sure to get feedback from people outside of the Bay Area. That's something that we don't hear often. I mean, you live there, you totally understand the culture there. You talk to people who live there or people who visit, and it's like there's kind of a bubble with some of the companies built there where it's like, yes, this works perfectly for at least 10 other startups that are based on the same floor of XYZ building. And you kind of like lose a little bit of that outside perspective, which for some fields is totally fine. Whereas for others, of course, things don't translate as well outside of those kind of ecosystems. Was that intentional when you guys did that? It sounds like it was, but that's so interesting that you guys made sure to kind of check all of those boxes.
Yeah, it was very intentional because if you think about it, ultimately, our intent and our ambition is to grow something that touches a lot of kids and a lot of families. I think part of it is the perspective that I've had. I grew up in Ohio, actually have lived on the East Coast, et cetera. So I think I am fortunate that just from even a personal perspective, I've seen, different places across the country or even different countries too. So just knowing that it was important for us to make sure that the concept actually resonated kind of beyond, right? Because when you talk to other folks, we're like, oh yeah. And then early on, we'd be like, yeah, we just saw like a few self-driving cars in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many people can say that? Right. It really is a special place, I think. And getting the feedback from folks kind of across the market that you're looking to serve is really important, even if you want to make sure you have a stronghold in a particular market.
So funny. Like, did you notice a difference in feedback from parents in the Bay versus outside of the Bay?
I think what was really interesting early on is we had all these hypotheses about the target market, right? Which is a good thing. You kind of think, okay, this is who we think we're going to serve, or is it going to be the busy working parent, right? Versus the stay-at-home mom or et cetera. And I think what we found really early on, it was definitely much more of that mindset. It was more of a psychographic cut that we saw, which is kind of what I described as busy, well-intentioned. Even the super crafty mom who does DIY projects every day with her kids is like, oh my gosh, I could use a little relief sometimes, right? And I love the idea of something that's so well thought out and is delivered conveniently to me. I think that's basically what we found out early on. And the one thing that we did discover that did apply kind of across the board as we were initially getting started is that we did skew a bit more, I would say, coastal in the beginning. So a little bit higher income, a little bit more from an education perspective, probably a little bit more. But at this point, we are kind of across the board. And we also have an education business now. So we're serving schools and groups. We've served over 10,000 institutions now. And what's really fantastic about that is we have a lot of Title I schools there too. So schools, lower income schools, schools where frankly there's underrepresentation when it comes to STEM. And so we're really excited about being able to touch a lot of different communities at this point.
How did you go about marketing to the rest of America to kind of get away from just being on the coast?
One of the things that we discovered pretty early on is that people like to talk about their kids. And so they love, for example, posting on social media. So organic word of mouth and kind of referrals were really, really key, actually, in the beginning. So we were very fortunate because that is a very effective and low cost way of getting the word out. And parents talk to parents, moms talk to moms. And if you think about each mom or each parent, they are in and of themselves a micro influencer. So we really try to encourage that, kind of share what your kids are doing and that sort of thing. And then from a marketing channel perspective, we have tested a lot of different channels. So kind of to your question of in the beginning, we started to collect email addresses before we launched. So we would go to Maker Faire, we'd go to the Palo Alto Art and Wine Festival. I mean, we definitely did a lot of things that don't scale, but that was the beginnings of an email base that is millions upon millions at this point. We also ended up trying things like, SEM and Google ads in the beginning, which was really interesting because they didn't work so well when we first got started over 10 years ago. I think part of it is this type of service, right? This idea, because the majority of our revenue, over 75% of it is recurring, right? It's subscription based. So you're getting a delightful kind of creative materials and inspiration every month. That wasn't something that was around actually at that point. So people weren't doing directed searches for that type of thing. And what's fascinating is now it works. I think that's another thing that's an interesting learning is that you may try certain marketing channels that you feel like you're kind of hitting a wall, right? But you should try them again because you never know when you may unlock some type of efficiency there just because the market has evolved or even because you've hit upon a different type of approach or creative that might unlock it. So I think that's what we've kind of discovered over time when it's come to marketing channels.
No, that's so interesting to think about coming back to things. One of the things I was going to ask you about that's sort of related to that is just how the tech industry has changed and sort of how people shop online has changed since you guys got started. You guys were pretty early to the D2C space. So I'm definitely curious, why that made the most sense when you guys got started and sort of how you guys have been able to, I know you're at retail stores now too, but how you've been able to kind of ride that technology wave, which definitely was super hot for a while, but you guys were a little before that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it really, again, just comes down to understanding who we were trying to serve and how we could actually serve them. Because I've also gotten the question before of, gosh, did you intend to be a subscription company? And it really was no. We really got to know the market. We got to understand that people were looking for these moments of discovery for their kids. And we could do that in a really convenient and delightful way. And so that service, that kind of method and mode of running the business made a lot of sense for the consumer, but it was also great for us as a business, right? So if you think about kind of recurring revenue, that was a great thing for us too. So that's how we kind of landed there. And we have been basically direct to consumer until the point in which we went to the wholesale channel, which was just a few months ago. So now we're in Target stores and we're in Barnes & Noble, and we're super excited about that because I think what we've learned through our experience in direct to consumer is that we understand our customers really well, and we feel like there's a real opportunity to serve them where they are. And so, yes, the online channel has worked very well for us. So we really scaled this business. But going to these retail channels is going to be really important to really meet different use cases that we can't meet today, right? There are many times when I am like, oh, Saturday morning, I have a birthday party to send my child to in the afternoon. And as much as KiwiCo.com is awesome, unfortunately, it's not going to really kind of fulfill that use case for that mom.
Definitely. And I want to ask you about the timing of launching in retail because we've had a bunch of D2C businesses on this year, actually. And so many of them only stayed D2C for a very short period of time. I'm trying to remember if it was Magic Spoon or Olipop, but one launched in stores like less than 2 years after they found it or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you guys obviously waited quite a while before making that jump. And why did that strategy make sense? And when did you guys know it was the right time to expand?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good question because you hit upon it, right? It is about strategy, and strategy is about making decisions, making trade-offs, deciding where you're going to invest and where you're not going to invest. I think it just really depends on the business, right? And so for us, when we would look at the opportunities and kind of like lay out the different types of initiatives where we could invest, what ended up bubbling to the top for many years were direct to consumer related initiatives, right? So we would launch a new line. We would want to innovate on something that was core to, let's say, our subscription business, or we would want to launch, we now have a really healthy kind of individual product e-commerce business. So the way you and I usually shop online. So we design those products now too. So there are just so many opportunities that were in front of us, including wholesale, that we had decided that we wanted to invest in some other things before we got there. I think the decision to launch in wholesale earlier makes a lot of sense for other businesses too. It was just for us, as we were looking at the lay of the land, that is what we had decided to do.
More from this conversation right after a quick break.
Something I've always wanted to ask a company like this is, how do you create a product like this? Like, how do you create a toy? How do you create a STEM toy? Like, what is the first thing you think of? Like, how do you do this?
We have a really talented team, I guess is the way I would describe it. It's interesting, right? We have a product development team that's dedicated to the physical product. And so I'll answer your question on that side. But we also have a product development team that's dedicated to our e-commerce platform and our content platform as well. So we have that side too. So if you think about our physical product team, they are comprised of people who are like industrial designers, mechanical engineers. We have folks who have founded bicycle companies and, that type of thing. And it really, again, is about kind of understanding what we're trying to do. What is it that we're trying to put out into the world, making sure that it resonates with kids in particular, actually, and with parents. And so we end up concepting quite a bit, kind of coming up with different ideas that are the combination of really fun and really enriching. We take those concepts, decide on which ones we want to kind of take to the next step. We prototype those really rough in the beginning, and then we put them in front of kids. We put them in front of kids several times throughout the process, right? So it's like ranging from the concept through to like nearly final materials and instructions. So it's like several times throughout the process, we're getting that feedback. One of the other things that I think is super interesting about that product development process, so all along the way, prototyping, making sure that we're getting the materials in place, putting in the orders, they ship to our warehouse, and then we're delivering those to kids and families. I think one thing that's interesting about any type of product development pipeline is that you usually have these like three constraints that you're dealing with. So you have kind of a price or a cost constraint. You have a timeline kind of constraint, like you want to deliver a launch at a certain point. And then you have a quality constraint. And this applies not only to, kids' products or toys, this applies to like an enterprise SaaS software, right? Like you're kind of like looking at all these different things and trying to weigh them. And sometimes you're like, I need to push our launch back. Like we're not going to hit that date, right? Or, I might need to increase the price for customers because we're finding that the cost for us is increasing or else. And I think what is unique about what we do is a lot of those things are set, right? So there's a price that people pay for our crates that's set, that we know that we have to meet. We have timelines. We have to send out a crate every single month to our customers that we have to meet. Like we can't slip on that. And then the other part of it is that our quality bar is really high. We wouldn't have the business that we have unless we had that quality bar. And so from the very first crate that we've sent out, we have customer data about that particular crate and every other experience that we've delivered. So we create scores that actually associate with satisfaction, that associate with the crate itself and cost profile. And so we have kind of this economic profile of each experience that we've sent out. And so we're actually able to use that data to send certain crates to certain customers at certain points in time.
And when you're designing these toys, are the product designers, do they also have a background in like educational STEM? Because I'm trying to figure out like, how do you create specifically like a STEM product where, this toy is also educational? Is there like a research and development within all of this, or like, do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I mean, so within our product design team, we have folks who are dedicated to insights. We do have folks who have kind of an education background. But I think the other part of it is we've developed a lot of experience ourselves. Like I mentioned, we've been doing this for over 10 years now. And so we have a really good understanding of how to make sure that kids are having a good time building and playing, but also are learning things. The way that we think about it is we want to embed kind of the STEM concepts, but we want to do it in a way that the kids can actually see what's happening, right? So an example would be we're innovating ourselves and we're launching a brand new line of refresh products right now. One of the products is like you're making your own bow and arrow set. So it's like archery. And so what the kids are doing is they're building this bow and arrow set. Then they are learning by doing. So then they're starting to play with it. And then we tell them in the collateral and in the videos that we follow up with, what you're doing there is you're actually learning about potential energy and kinetic energy. And how cool is it that we're able to do that in a really accessible and fun way? So kids are learning these science concepts, learning how the world works, but doing it through play. And that's kind of what we do throughout. And it's like a magical moment. And so not only are they doing that, we have targets where there's numbers on one side and there's like kind of imaginative kind of play on the other. And with the numbers, they're learning about math. So it's like we're embedding each of those concepts for them kind of along the way, but not in a way that's heavy-handed. Like one of our brand tenets is to make sure that it's fun and that it's genuinely accessible for kids. So they're learning by doing. We're not bopping them over the head with the hard words first, right? We're saying, hey, did you notice that thing? And by the way, this is what it's called.
Yeah, that's really, really fun. I'm wondering now, what was it like pitching this company? Like, did investors automatically get it? Or did you have to like sit down and explain a lot?
It was interesting pitching this company. It was definitely a process. Some people really understood what we were trying to do, right? Kind of our ethos and our intent and our motivation. I think early on, right, as I mentioned, we raised $10 million, a little more than that in accumulation and summation, right, through a seed round of Series A. So the last money that we raised was at the end of 2014, beginning of 2015. So it was very early in our journey. And at that point, I think investors are very much looking for proof points, but they're also looking at the team. They're looking at the kind of the potential in the market. Early on, investors do a lot of kind of pattern matching, I think, right? So if you think about seed round, Series A, and if you look at KiwiCo, it's very much kind of like for kids. It's for families. Part of the reason for being was, because I'm a mom and I want to do something for my kids and want to extend this to others. And I don't think that's the pattern that investors on Santo necessarily see. I would say I was probably like the only minivan in those parking lots, actually. And so I think what was really important, and again, just super fortunate that I had connections, right? I had been at startups. I'd been at PayPal, launched PayPal Mobile. I'd been at eBay, was a GM for eBay Fashion. And so I came with a certain amount of credibility, but I did find I had to lead with that when pitching because they are investing in a team. And so saying like, hey, you can believe that I can build this business because I started with, frankly, a little rundown of my resume first. And then I would talk about, oh, and by the way, one of the most kind of important parts and relevant pieces of experience that I have is that I'm a mom of 2 kids at the time in the beginning, but now 3 kids. And so I think that that is kind of a unique experience for folks who are pitching, having to kind of build that piece up and then kind of bringing that piece that I think is really important and makes me somewhat uniquely qualified, right? Is that I am actually a parent, but I don't think people are necessarily saying like, I want to invest specifically in mompreneurs type of thing.
Right. That's a really interesting way to think about it. I did want to ask you about one other thing about the funding piece. There's so much debate, I feel like, in venture, and I don't know if these kind of debates were happening then or not, but about how like you either bootstrap and you don't raise money, or you bootstrap and then you raise little money, or you just raise venture capital. You'd rarely hear of companies like this where it's like, oh, you raised a couple rounds and then we're like, we don't need this anymore. So I'm curious how you guys thought through that and why you guys maybe decided not to continue raising money on that venture capital track.
Yeah, I mean, early on, we needed the capital because the fact of the matter is, as a business that has an e-commerce component and then a heavy physical product component, you need that kind of startup capital to be able to buy into the products that you want to be sending out to customers. So it's like to kick start that flywheel and make that investment in inventory, the capital is pretty important. And so that was one of the reasons why we ended up deciding early on to raise money for the business, is that we needed that in order to get things going. The great thing is once we got things going, we got to a place where we were profitable and cash flow positive. So at this point, we've had 7 years of operating profit and we've been able to fund our own growth. It's not that we won't raise money again at some point. We might, right? If it makes sense. But I think we are lucky in that we can decide when that time actually is.
VCs hate profit. I don't like that. I don't want to back companies like that, which is one of the very fun dichotomies about this industry. Switching gears a little bit, thinking about your background, and of course you were in the startup space working as an operator, but did you ever think you would actually launch a company of your own? Especially a company in this area? Like, of course it ties to your background because you are a mom, you wanted these products for your own kids, but it doesn't tie necessarily as much to like the experiences, the jobs you had. You're not solving a pain point you had at Poshmark, like kind of thing. Did you ever think you would launch your own company? And how do you feel looking back at it now that this is the company that you did launch at the end of the day?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right, to look back on things, right? Because there's like the intent and then you kind of look back at it. And I am not the person who said, like, I need to start a company, right? I think there are people who have that in their minds, like that is what they want to do. And that's amazing that they want to do that. But it wasn't something that was kind of on my list of things that I needed to do. It really came about because of the fact that I had this kind of personal need. And what was really fascinating looking back on it is my experiences, when you look at them all together, it makes sense that this is the company that I was meant to start, though. And so I'm like, if I were to start a company, this is absolutely the company that I was meant to start. I mean, growing up, like I said, I made a lot of stuff as a kid. I went to school and had these amazing like project-based experiences that I think are embedded in KiwiCo too in some way. I was an engineer. I worked in consumer products, developing products for millions and billions of consumers. So knowing how to do product development there. And then I was at PayPal and eBay, where it's like e-commerce, like payments and things like that. And then the mom piece, right? So it's kind of, you put all this together and it's like, wow. Oh, and also when I was young, my parents were entrepreneurs. We had a kiosk in the mall and we sold toys too, right? And so it's like, it kind of comes full circle. And I think it's really fascinating to think about it that way because it's definitely not what I had intended. But looking back on it, it makes a lot of sense when you put it all together.
No, I totally get that. I had a similar conversation with my dad about becoming a reporter when he was like, well, did it ever occur to you that not every kid was consistently subscribed to a magazine since age 7, their whole childhood? Did it not occur to you that that wasn't something everyone did?
That it all builds up.
I was like, no, it had not occurred to me. That's not something everyone did. But I'm definitely curious about what has it been like for you personally? Because I know working at a company, even if it's a startup, fast paced, of course, we're all reading about founder mode, everyone's in the office, etc. It's very different from running a company of your own. Even on the personal side, it takes up a ton of time. It takes up resources. It changes like the dynamic of how families operate and things like that. What has it been like for you personally and being able to manage both sides, especially going from having a job where that wasn't as big of a factor?
I would describe it as hard, but also highly rewarding. Hard in that we all have limited hours in the day. And starting a company, running a company, it takes time and it takes energy. And so I think the fact of the matter is sometimes there are trade-offs that need to be made. There's also kind of the emotional toll to it too, right? I mean, there's a lot that's sometimes weighing on your mind. And so I think hard in that way, but been really fortunate. My husband has been incredibly supportive. And so I feel very, very fortunate. I would say the other part of it, and it being really rewarding, is this is a company that my kids can be involved in too. So it's actually pretty unique. Like they were chief product testers from the beginning. Just yesterday, we celebrated a huge launch for us. We launched KiwiCo clubs, and my two older kids came and helped out with the celebration. And so I think they are able to kind of appreciate this entrepreneurial journey. They're able to appreciate clearly the products and the experiences that we're designing too. And I think that that's a pretty cool thing. They're able to see their mom in mom mode at home, but they're able to also see mom in entrepreneur CEO mode too, right? We all have these different kind of angles and facets to who we are. And they're able to see kind of both modes, which is a really neat thing, I think, too.
Talking a little bit about you as a leader and you as a CEO. Well, first, how big is your team at the company?
We have about 150 employees.
And how would you describe yourself as a leader?
I would describe myself as someone who leads by example, someone who is definitely willing to get their hands dirty, and someone who has high expectations of the team and of herself as a leader too. So I will set up big goals and big visions in an attempt to reach them and try to really support the team kind of from the bottom up as well.
And I always love asking companies this question, especially companies with products like this. Do you have any stories, like any early stories of, not necessarily failure, but maybe mishaps where maybe you lost like the shipping of a product, or kind of early mishaps in the company's story that you look back on and that are kind of funny now, but were not funny then?
We've had a lot. I mean, so I'm like, which one to choose? Gosh, I mean, I'll tell you a couple actually. So I remember early on, we were doing kind of our first alpha shipment. And as much as I said that I've experienced in e-commerce, it was like at, eBay and PayPal where we had no inventory, right? So we're dealing with a physical product in e-commerce for the first time. And we were packing out a shipment of about 18 crates. And there were, I think, maybe 6 of us. It took us all day. And we looked at each other at the end of the day and we're like, holy crap, if it's going to take this long to ship out 18 boxes, we are in deep, deep trouble. And so I just remember kind of like that. And now thinking about the fact that we've shipped out 50 million crates and walking around our warehouse, like it's funny now, but at the time it was actually quite worrisome for us. And a lot of us had come from consumer, but more kind of like on the software side of things too, right? So kind of that reality of dealing with a physical product was an interesting one. Like when we first got our shipment of just crates, like physical crates on pallets, the idea of space planning was kind of new to us as well. Another thing that had happened to us too is somewhat early on, this is just a couple years in, we were sending puffy paint to kids. And what we discovered is when you send puffy paint to kids in December, sometimes it freezes in the nozzle. And so you may have minor explosions. So we caught that and we rectified it, but it's funny when you think about it, but not so funny when you are testing it. You discover this fun fact. And so I think we've learned a lot about kind of like what works and what we should be sending out at what times. And so that was an interesting kind of lesson learned early on, fortunately, before it became something bigger.
Definitely. No, that must be complicated too, because if you expand your products into new areas or just products that, we're using this type of glue that we don't usually use, there's so much more product testing involved here than some other companies.
For sure. I mean, even if you think about something like a clay, right? Some of that is really hard to work with and some is malleable enough for small hands. And so it's like, not only are you testing the project altogether, kind of in the build of those projects, but sometimes you have to test individual materials as well to make sure that they're kind of kid and age appropriate.
I cannot get off the explosions. Like, how do you find out that glue can explode? Like, how did you find that out?
Well, what we do is, again, we test all along the way, right? And including internal testing. And so when things start to get delivered, we test the materials and we test the projects too. So as we were testing, we noticed it was hard to push this. It was actually like a puffy paint, right? So imagine little balls with the little nozzles that look like glue. You're totally right. They look like glue. And so it was hard, right? And so as you squeezed, because the material actually changed, right, and hardened, it would create a bit of a mess. And that is one thing that we learned very quickly, even in my initial focus groups that I described, is parents definitely don't want a big mess delivered to them, right? Something is arriving on their doorstep for them and their kids, and they're not looking for that to be a super, super messy experience. It was just based on doing is kind of how we discovered that.
That is so, I mean, like, well, I grew up in Florida, so I'm like, this would not have applied to me, but I'm like, the winter months up north, that would have been not funny, but like, I would have chuckled a bit.
For sure.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, we only have time, I think, for one last question. Wrapping it up here, looking at how far you guys have been able to come, as you mentioned, you guys have been around for over a decade now, but you are still innovating, still adding these new product lines, new retail channels, and things like that. What's next? How would you describe where you're at in the company now and sort of like what the next 5 years look like for you guys?
You're catching me at a really interesting time. We are literally launching something really significant today. So we're launching something called KiwiCo Clubs. It is really based on the experience that we gained having shipped all of these experiences to kids. We've learned a lot about what kids and families are looking for. I've touched on some of those things, like they're looking for fun, they're looking for discoveries. We've learned that learning is a journey and that the kind of accumulation of these discoveries can lead kids to really build their creative confidence and problem solving skills. They can learn a lot around different STEM concepts by this kind of learning journey. And so KiwiCo Clubs is us basically innovating on ourselves. So we have completely reimagined the core products that we deliver to kids, and we're launching them now, and we're super excited about it. And I think that it'll tee us up nicely for the future and enable us to continue to extend our leadership in providing these STEM experiences for kids. So that's a big one. You're just kind of catching me there. But I mean, some of the other things that we touched on. So our publishing business, we've kicked off. So we actually publish books as well. We've sent out over 5 million books to kids. I mentioned our schools and groups business, and certainly super excited about our wholesale business and looking to extend that as well. So all of these different opportunities to kind of meet the customers where they are.
No, that sounds like a very nice place to wrap then. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been super interesting.
My pleasure. It was super fun to talk to you both.
And that was our conversation with Sandra. Dom, what was the lie?
The lie was that in the early days, KiwiCo tested their products with kids but didn't survey parents. KiwiCo actually tested both parents and kids. And she spoke about how she made sure to test the product with parents, not just in the Bay Area, too.
I thought that was definitely one of the most interesting aspects of the early founding story. Sometimes we have founders on who come up with an idea, they like chat with a few friends, and then they just like launch it. And it feels like Sandra was so intentional about it. It almost seems like she was doubting herself in the beginning. So she like really wanted to get like a lot of reassurance that, okay, not only would like my friends buy this, but I want to make sure that kids would like it. I want to make sure that people outside of our area, outside of our interests, very different from us, would also buy this. And I feel like that's really smart because, I mean, I definitely thought looking at this company for the first time, based on how much the boxes cost a month, which, I mean, we were just talking off the recording about how maybe that isn't that much in the grand scheme of things as 3 women talking about it who don't have kids and have no idea how much people spend on that kind of stuff. But I thought it was really interesting, yeah, that she like put all of that like front end work before they even launched.
I know, it really got me thinking about the psychology of toys. Like, do kids in the Bay Area play with different toys versus like kids in the Midwest or something like that? And it's good to see that, like you were saying, I know nothing about like toys and like and how much toys cost, but I do really, really like the idea of this product in terms of educational toys, things that can teach people something. And I was trying to think throughout the conversation is like, how often do new toys come about? Is it like a market that's always disrupted or like kind of really not really?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I feel like so much of it's probably driven by like pop culture stuff. Like, oh, a Disney movie comes out, like new toys surrounding that come out. But like, yeah, I don't actually know how much the space gets disrupted. But clearly there is a need for this subscription kind of company because they were able to grow like very fast. very quickly.
I know, subscription toy company. Yeah, I know, because I was thinking, because like a few years ago, I interviewed like this guy who was like disrupting the applesauce market by like releasing applesauce. And so I was like, yeah, applesauce does like never disrupt it. Like, who releases new applesauce? And that's why I was thinking, I was like, how often do new toys come out? But then again, how would we know?
Right.
Like what the new hottest toy is?
Yeah, we're not the people to ask.
We're not the audience. But no, yeah, I really like the focus on STEM and toys, because I'm thinking like, I don't know, what did I play? I played with like brats were not STEM.
Yeah, because I think one of the other things I like about this too is that the STEM focus is part of it, but it's also just like the imagination piece of it. Like, I feel like some stuff that's too like, kids need to be doing STEM, kids be doing this and that. And it's like, well, some kids are going to want to do like art projects and stuff. And I feel like this does a good job of like marrying the two together. So you get the educational piece, but it's also not just like, some kids are just straight up not going to be interested in the STEM heavy stuff. So I like that this kind of marries the two in a way that's probably helps them out on their end.
And we also got to talk with a rare founder who fundraised just enough money and was like, I'll see you later.
Oh, I know. To think about just like no longer needing to raise money. Because like I mentioned when we were chatting with her, you so often hear of people being like, I bootstrapped till this point and then raised money. You used to really hear of people being like, I raised money early and then just never took it again.
I know, right? I don't know. I feel like some founders get really obsessed with like the valuation and the numbers and everything. But there's also like a lot of risks that come with just taking a bunch of venture capital dollars. So I always love hearing somebody who got just what they needed and wanted and was like, all right, bye, hats off.
Oh, I know. And I think probably you can trace some of the decisions that the company has made and the timeline they've made them on to the fact that they didn't raise more venture capital. I'm sure they would have expanded into retail a lot earlier than they had if they had VCs who probably would have been telling them like, oh, there's this whole other revenue stream we're like not even tapping into. Like, I could see how they built in the way that they did because they probably didn't have those outside influences pushing them toward like a more traditional venture, like rollout and expansion.
Yeah, they had a nice kind of slow growth. Like they had what they needed to have. Nothing was like aggressive. Because I think she said that the product really spread by word of mouth.
Yeah.
So I guess those parent chats were like the little Facebook parent chats. I don't know. I mean, that's really impressive.
Right. I don't know. It's just like one of those companies that goes to show that like venture capital is just like not always it. Even if you raise, I feel like people get stuck on the track, like the flywheel, like they just like have to keep hitting these things. They have to keep going. And it's kind of like, if you need to be doing that, your company wasn't built to be sustainable to begin with. Whereas like she built this to be sustainable, needed that funding to get to the next step. But then it was like, no, like she built it to be sustainable. She doesn't necessarily just like need a ton more funding.
I know. And now look at her expanding into stores, schools, a publishing arm. I love how like the evolution of the company is like naturally brilliant things. Like, of course, they would have a publishing arm that makes so much sense. Like, of course, they would move into that next.
It really does make sense. And it was good to hear her talk about expanding this way as a company that is not SaaS. Like, it's not software. Like, expanding and scaling and things like that is a bit different for them because they literally produce physical items that need to be changed and up to code because it's kids stuff and etc. So them being able to like grow in the way they did and like how they have expanded is just so interesting because it is different than saying like, we're a cybersecurity company. We're launching in California next month, which literally means like setting up our state license and then saying we're in California because it's a software. Like, it's like, this is very different when they have to expand because it's all physical goods.
Yeah. Another thing that I really love about companies like this and even like TennyBot, you know, it shows that not everything has to be like SaaS. Not everything has to be like AI or whatever. Like, you can disrupt other markets. Like, it's like you can create like a toy company or an applesauce company. It's okay.
For sure. Now I'm thinking of all the like former Web3 founders who are now like all AI founders. And it's like, or you could just find an idea for something that doesn't follow the trends and is something that people actually want to purchase.
Yeah, there's so many things that like need to be fixed and done. Like, I can't think of things immediately, but like, you know, that's what they're there for, I guess, to figure it out. We need new toys.
Right. Sometimes it's like the ideas are just not as complicated as I think people want them to have to be.
Yeah, let this be a lesson, I guess.
Found is hosted by myself, TechCrunch senior reporter Becca Skutak, alongside senior reporter Dominic Midori-Davis. Found is produced by Maggie Stamets with editing by Kel. Our illustrator is Bryce Durbin. Found's audience development and social media is managed by Morgan Little, Alyssa Stringer, and Natalie Kreisman. TechCrunch's audio products are managed by Henry Pickavet. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.